Hey guys, tonight we step into a place where your alarm clock is a heavy brass bell, and your first thought of the day isn't coffee, but prayer. You wake before the sun, wrapped in a thin wool robe that scratches just enough to remind you you're alive. The chill clings to your bones, the kind of cold that makes you question all your life choices. Though let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this schedule for even 1 week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, if you're listening from somewhere particular, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love to see where in the world you all are nodding off. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You hear it. The bell tolls again, vibrating through the stone walls like the heartbeat of the monastery. It's not a gentle sound, not a smartphone chime pretending to be pleasant. It's more like a medieval way of saying, get up or else. You trudge across a flagstone floor, toes curling against the cold, and make your way to the chapel. The monks, silent and spectral in the half-darkness, glide past you like a choir of sleepwalkers. Their sandals slap against the stone with a rhythm steadier than any modern snooze button. Your stomach growls already. It's been 12 hours since your last bite, maybe longer. Unlike you, these monks don't roll out of bed and reach for cereal or a quick espresso. Instead, they believe hunger sharpens prayer, like tuning a string before the song. Historians still argue whether this daily half-starvation was a spiritual discipline or simply necessity born from scarcity. Either way, you're along for the ride now, and breakfast is still an hour away. The air smells of wax and incense, a heady mix that clings to your hair. It's calming and irritating at the same time, like when you accidentally spray too much cologne and then pretend you meant it. You notice your breath puffing faintly in the cold, as though the whole chapel is exhaling with you. And you stand there, knees threatening to buckle, as Latin chants begin to rise and echo from the stone vaults above. You're trying to focus on prayer, but let's face it, your brain is already wandering toward the pantry. What will breakfast be? Hard bread, maybe cheese, the promise of lentil porridge. It's the kind of mental game where your imagination is tastier than reality. Mainstream accounts confirm that monks usually got barley bread with water at dawn, with something a little more substantial later in the day. Yet, a quirky tidbit survives. In some houses, the very first breakfast wasn't food at all, but a single sip of weak ale, barely more nourishing than a cup of flavored water. Imagine explaining that to your modern nutritionist. The chanting continues. You shift on the bench, knees aching, hunger gnawing, eyelids drooping. The rhythm of the prayers begins to blend with the sound of your stomach's protests, like a duet nobody asked for. And still, you hold on. You realize that here, in this cloister, the day is meant to be measured not by your appetite but by bells, by ritual, by the endless tug-of-war between body and soul. Then, at last, the final note lingers, the silence returns, and the bell tolls once more. This time, it's not a call to prayer, it's a summons to the refectory. Relief shuffles through the line of monks like a secret wave. You fall in step, the stone floor still freezing, but the thought of that first crust of bread pulls you forward. You're ready for your first medieval breakfast, however bland, however small, and you know it will taste like heaven, at least compared to nothing.
The silence lingers as you shuffle out of the chapel, the last hum of chanting fading like smoke into the morning air. You're still half asleep, still wondering if your stomach might start its own hymn at any moment. The cloistered walkway is damp with dew, the stone archways funneling a chill draft that seems to whisper, "You're not getting pancakes today." The truth is, monks didn't leap from prayer into banquets. The gap between spiritual duty and that first mouthful could stretch thin and long, and in that stretched space you start to feel every single ounce of your body reminding you that you skipped dinner last night. You fall into line behind the brothers. They move without chatter, their silence as deliberate as their steps. Historians still argue whether the vow of silence was truly absolute or just carefully applied, because honestly, could anyone keep from muttering when the bread ran out? Still, the atmosphere is thick with restraint. The only sounds are sandals brushing stone, the occasional cough swallowed quickly, and the caw of a distant crow that clearly doesn't care about monastery rules. Your mind begins to wander, and with wandering comes imagination. You picture your modern self in a monastery kitchen, whisper shouting at the cook, "Where's the coffee machine? The oats? At least a banana." But here, silence rules. The expectation is that your stomach learns to pray before your mouth learns to chew. Inside the refectory, light spills through narrow windows, gray and weak like a pale broth. Long wooden tables stretch before you, smooth from centuries of elbows, bowls, and restless fingers tapping. You notice the benches are just as hard as the bread you're hoping for. The monks take their places, each one facing inward, eyes lowered, hands folded. You sit among them, realizing that breakfast here is less about eating and more about ritual choreography. A bell rings again, softer now. You wait. A single monk begins to read aloud from scripture, his voice like warm gravel rolling in a bucket. The reading will continue through the meal, meaning nobody talks. You're meant to digest words as much as food. It's like dinner theater, but with no dinner and no theater. The servers come. Not waiters with trays and smiles, but brothers carrying baskets and jugs, moving with the precision of men who've done this 1,000 times. A coarse barley loaf appears, its crust blackened from the oven, its inside dense enough to double as a doorstop. And yet, in your hunger, you stare at it as if it were cake. Mainstream accounts describe how this bread was made with whatever grain was cheapest, barley, rye, sometimes oats, and often stretched with ground peas or beans to make it last longer. Imagine sourdough, but someone forgot to add joy. Still, there's comfort in the simplicity. You tear off a piece, the crumbs scattering like gravel across the table, and chew slowly. The taste is earthy, bland, slightly sour, but undeniably filling. Your jaws work harder than they would on toast, and you suspect this bread might double as a dental plan. Historians still argue whether this rough diet actually preserved monks' teeth better than the sugar-laden feasts of nobles outside. Alongside the bread, a clay cup of water is placed before you. Not wine, not ale, not yet. Just water, cool from the well, carrying with it a faint mineral tang that whispers of stone and soil. And here's your quirky tidbit, in some monasteries, water wasn't the expected drink at all. Instead, the brothers got small beer, a super weak ale with barely enough alcohol to matter, safer than untreated river water. To your modern palate, it would taste like flat barley tea with attitude. But here, today, it's plain water. You sip, and it feels pure, almost sharp in contrast to the heaviness of the bread. You sit in that silence, bread in hand, scripture rolling over your ears, stomach easing from desperate growl to gentle purr. You think of your modern breakfasts, smoothies, lattes, pastries with too much frosting, and compare them to this, one crust, one cup, one reading voice. Stripped down, bare, but strangely grounding. And as you chew, you catch yourself thinking, maybe there's something in this ritual. Maybe the stillness makes each bite feel like more. Or maybe you're just so hungry that even barley feels like luxury. Either way, the silence before sunrise has filled you with something, discipline, patience, or at least enough crumbs to keep your stomach from rioting. You cradle the last of your barley crust like it's a precious relic, nibbling each bite so slowly that even a snail would call you dramatic. Your jaw aches, your stomach still feels half empty, and yet there's a strange comfort in the rhythm of chew, swallow, breathe. The scripture continues in the background, words blending into a steady drone. You don't catch every syllable, maybe not even half, but the sound is less about meaning and more about mood, like medieval white noise for the soul. Then it happens, the servers return, baskets lighter, jugs nearly empty. No refills here. Breakfast is finite, measured, portioned. You set down your crumb-dusted fingers and realize you've survived the first round. Barely. Your modern brain screams for butter, for jam, maybe just a smear of Nutella. But no, you get the raw deal, bread in its most honest, most unadorned form. And that's the point, humility, discipline, no frills. A reminder that food, like prayer, is about sustenance, not indulgence. You look around the refectory. Not a single monk complains. No raised eyebrows, no sly jokes about the bread's flavor. They eat with quiet acceptance, even reverence. This is breakfast as ritual, breakfast as obedience. Historians still argue whether the uniformity of meals was spiritual training or simply practicality. One recipe was cheaper and faster to produce than a dozen. Either way, the bread stands as a symbol of shared life, each crust linking one monk to another across time. But here's your quirky tidbit, some monasteries actually rationed bread weights so precisely that a monk might know his daily allowance down to the ounce. A loaf could be 12 ounces, divided into 3 chunks for different times of the day. Imagine a nutrition label, medieval style, per serving, enough to stop you fainting, but not enough to make you smile. And yes, archaeologists sometimes uncover these monastery loaves in old ovens, blackened beyond recognition but still intact, like history's most unappetizing fossils. You gnaw your last bite and sit back, belly not quite satisfied but not howling anymore. You start to wonder, was this actually healthier? A hunk of whole grain bread, full of fiber, no sugar crash waiting around the corner. Compare that to your frosted cereal, your maple-drenched waffles. Maybe the monks knew something you forgot, that simple food gives steady energy, if not joy. And yet, let's be real, could you do this every morning? Probably not, unless your idea of happiness is endless dental exercise. The reading ends. The bell tolls again, not harsh this time but gentle, a cue to rise. You follow the line of monks as they leave the hall, silent as shadows. Outside, the sun has finally broken the horizon, spilling gold across the cloister courtyard. The air feels lighter now, tinged with wood smoke and damp earth. You breathe deeply, bread still sitting heavily in your stomach like a stone, but at least it's your stone, earned bite by bite. And as you walk toward the work waiting for you, gardens to tend, books to copy, you realize this was only the first act of breakfast. Because sometimes, depending on the season or the house rules, there might be more waiting, cheese, honey, or even a lentil porridge so thick it could double as wall plaster. You're not sure if that's a reward or a punishment, but you'll find out soon enough. You shuffle along the cloister, belly weighted down with bread that feels more like ballast than nourishment. The faint damp of the stone seeps into your sandals, and the cool morning air wraps itself around you like a woolen cloak that someone forgot to wash. The sun is brighter now, casting long shadows of arches and pillars, and you can almost hear your modern self begging for a cappuccino. But instead of foam art, you're headed for water. Plain, simple, unflavored water. A clay jug sits on the table, droplets running down its side from the chill of the well. You pour a cup, the liquid clear but carrying that earthy tang of limestone. You sip it, and for a moment it's refreshing, brighter than the bread, sharper on the tongue. Then the realization sets in, this is it. No milk froth, no sugar cube, no pumpkin spice monk latte in sight. Just water, and silence. Still, it's worth remembering that in a world without coffee, hydration was the morning boost. The monks believed water purified the body as prayer purified the soul. Mainstream historical accounts remind us that many medieval wells were cleaner than rivers, though not without risks. And here comes your quirky tidbit. Some monasteries trusted their wells so much they built them directly inside cloisters, so brothers never had to fetch water from the village. Talk about convenience, Uber Eats could never. But not every monastery relied on water alone. Historians still argue whether small beer, weak, low-alcohol ale, was more common at breakfast than plain water. Some chronicles mention monks sipping it like a safe alternative, barely enough alcohol to notice, but enough to kill off the germs lurking in untreated water. Imagine drinking flat barley soda first thing in the morning and convincing yourself it's health food. And who knows, maybe their microbiomes were thanking them all along. You take another sip of your plain water, and your stomach rumbles with mild betrayal. The bread sits like a lump of clay inside you, and the water only sloshes against it, doing its best to soften the edges. You half wish for the fizz of soda or the jolt of caffeine, but instead you're left with a kind of austere clarity. The monks might say that's the point, water strips away distraction. Your body stays awake by its own design, not by chemical kick. You glance at the brothers around you, each one sipping in the same measured silence, as if the entire act of drinking were a prayer. Their eyes remain downcast, their hands steady on the rough cups. There's no rushing, no gulping, no anxious multitasking while scrolling through a phone. Just sip, pause, breathe. The ritual makes water feel less like a bare minimum and more like a sacred reminder, you're alive, and you need nothing more than what the earth gives. Of course, your modern brain rebels. You think of your own kitchen at home, rows of teas, stacks of coffee pods, flavored sparkling waters that promise essence of mango, but taste more like regret. Compared to that, this plain sip feels almost punishing. And yet, there's a kind of relief hidden in its simplicity. No choices to make, no calories to count, no decision fatigue. Just water. The bell chimes again, low and steady, and the monks set down their cups as if on cue. The silence deepens, and you realize breakfast isn't about satisfaction here, it's about rhythm. Prayer, bread, water, work. Like the steady ticking of a clock. And as you rise from the table, your stomach still unfulfilled but your mind strangely quiet, you wonder whether we've overcomplicated mornings. Maybe the monks were healthier not because their food was miraculous, but because it was so plain, so predictable, so easy on the soul. You step back into the courtyard, feeling the faint weight of bread and water in your belly, and you sense there's more to come. Somewhere in the cellar, a wheel of cheese waits. And the thought of it, just a sliver, just a crumb, suddenly feels more thrilling than any buffet you've ever seen. You follow the faint smell of earth and straw down into the cellar, where the air is cooler, damp, and heavy with the sharp tang of aging dairy. Down here, barrels line the walls, baskets are stacked high, and on wooden shelves sit the monastery's modest treasures, wheels of cheese. To your modern eyes, they look like forgotten stones, round, rough, crusted with dust and mold. To the monks, though, these wheels are edible wealth, a long-lasting store of protein and fat, something far more valuable than it might appear. Cheese is a tricky business in monastic life. Mainstream historical sources agree that cheese was a common food in medieval Europe, but whether monks ate it freely is another matter. Rules varied by order, by century, even by individual abbots. Some houses allowed it daily in moderation, others restricted it to feast days or to those with weaker stomachs. Which is a polite way of saying, Brother Thomas looks pale, give him extra cheese. And here's your quirky tidbit, certain monasteries debated whether eating cheese broke fasting rules, because it technically comes from milk, which is an animal product. Historians still argue whether cheese counted as too indulgent, or if it was simply dairy's more acceptable disguise. You watch as a monk slices a wheel with a small knife, portioning the wedges with mathematical precision. No generous heaping here, every slice is weighed by fairness and rule. The piece on your wooden plate is thin, almost translucent at the edges. It smells sharp, tangy, like grass and smoke and something faintly barnyard. You raise it to your lips and chew. It crumbles, salty and sour, but after days of nothing but bread and water, it feels like a banquet. You imagine, for a moment, swapping your usual modern cheddar for this crumbly wedge. Would you survive? Probably yes. Would you enjoy it? Well, that depends on how forgiving your taste buds are. But here in the monastery, cheese wasn't about luxury, it was about balance. Bread filled your stomach, water cleansed you, and cheese added the fat and protein to keep you from collapsing during a long day in the fields. In its plain, austere way, it worked. Yet the debates around it never stopped. Some abbots banned it altogether, worried it led brothers astray into gluttony. Others encouraged it, believing it sustained hard labor. Imagine the scene, monks in heated discussion over cheese slices, one side whispering, "This is temptation," the other, "This is lunch." You almost want to laugh, because who knew dairy could cause theological uproar? The cellar feels colder as you finish your wedge. The torchlight flickers against stone, and you sense how carefully this space was maintained. Cheese wasn't just food, it was preservation, stability. A wheel could last months, giving monks insurance against famine. Each bite carried not just nutrition but security, a reminder that survival was a daily, deliberate act. You set down your plate, stomach a little steadier now. Bread, water, and cheese, it's not a feast, but it's a triangle of balance. And in the silence, broken only by the creak of wood and the drip of water from the ceiling, you start to wonder, did the monks know something we've forgotten? Was restraint itself a kind of health? Or were they simply making do with what they had? As you climb back toward the daylight, the tang of cheese still on your tongue, you hear the faint buzz of bees drifting in from the garden above. And with that sound comes the promise of something sweeter. Rare, precious, and golden. Honey. You step into the cloister garden, sunlight finally pouring over the hedges, and the air hums with the low, steady drone of bees. It's almost hypnotic, like nature's own Gregorian chant, buzzing in layers as they dart between wildflowers. You follow the sound to the hives, simple woven skeps tucked neatly in a corner where monks have set them to keep their tiny alchemists busy. And suddenly, breakfast seems a little brighter, today there might be honey. Now, don't get too excited. Honey isn't a daily staple here, it's a treasure, reserved for special occasions, feast days, or as medicine. Mainstream accounts remind us that sugar was virtually unknown in medieval Europe until later centuries, which meant honey was the only real sweetener available. It flavored sauces, preserved fruits, and occasionally, if the abbot allowed, drizzled onto bread at dawn. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of dessert for breakfast, except instead of pancakes dripping with syrup, you're holding a crust of barley bread with one golden streak of sweetness. You watch as a brother carefully cracks open a comb, the wax glistening in the light, honey oozing slowly like liquid amber. He spoons the tiniest amount onto a dish, portioning it out like gold dust. Your share is no more than a teaspoon, but when you spread it onto your hard crust, the transformation is miraculous. The bread softens just enough, the sweetness mingling with the sour tang, and for a fleeting moment you feel spoiled, like a medieval noble sneaking into the monastery hall. Here's your quirky tidbit, honey wasn't just food, it was also medicine, prescribed for sore throats, mixed into salves, or smeared onto wounds. Some monasteries even brewed mead, though whether monks sipped it regularly is debated. Imagine a monastery pharmacist muttering, "Take 2 spoonfuls of honey and call me holy in the morning." And historians still argue whether honey was a luxury too tempting for monks, blurring the line between necessary nourishment and sinful indulgence. You lick a bit from your fingers, sticky and sweet, and can't help but compare it to your modern breakfasts. 1 teaspoon of honey versus the sugar tsunami of a frosted donut. Who's healthier now? The monks, no question. And yet, you can't shake the irony, a dollop of honey felt decadent to them, while you might drizzle half a bottle into your tea without blinking. Maybe moderation really is the secret sauce, if only it weren't so sticky. The bees keep working, indifferent to your musings. Their wings catch the sunlight, their little bodies glinting like living sparks. You imagine the monks seeing them not just as insects but as metaphors, tiny creatures laboring without complaint, each drop of honey a reminder of discipline and communal effort. You take another bite, savoring the faint sweetness, and realize this is breakfast at its most symbolic. Bread for body, honey for soul. And then, just as quickly as it began, the honey is gone. The dish is empty, the bread reduced to crumbs, the sweetness lingering only on your tongue. You're left with a mix of satisfaction and longing, the same tension that defines monastic life, enough to live, never enough to indulge. The bell calls again, deeper now, and the monks rise to begin their morning work. But you, lucky guest, linger a little longer, sticky-fingered and smiling faintly. Ahead waits something humbler, earthier, less glamorous than honey, but just as defining of the monastic table. A clay bowl filled with lentil porridge, steaming like the promise of warmth on a cold stone morning. You follow the faint aroma of earth and smoke into the kitchen, a space that feels more like a blackened cave than the bright, tiled rooms you know. The hearth glows in the corner, embers giving off a lazy heat. Iron pots hang on hooks, soot streaking the walls like the fingerprints of centuries. And at the center, resting on the edge of the fire, is your next breakfast guest, a clay pot of lentil porridge. Steam curls from the rim, carrying a smell that is neither inviting nor offensive, just plain. Earthy, a little grassy, with a hint of ash from the fire. You dip a wooden spoon into the thick stew and lift a glob that clings stubbornly, refusing to drip. It looks like beige mud, and honestly, you're not far off. Lentils, water, maybe a pinch of onion or leek if the cook was feeling generous. This is not the stuff of food commercials. But in the monastery, porridge means warmth, protein, and endurance. Mainstream historians note that legumes, lentils, peas, beans, were staples of the medieval cloister. They grew easily in monastery gardens, filled bellies, and could be dried for storage. They were also firmly safe under fasting rules since they weren't meat, eggs, or dairy. The monks leaned heavily on them, and breakfast porridge was often their way of stretching a little nutrition as far as possible. You take a bite. It's thick, grainy, faintly bitter. You chew, though chewing isn't strictly necessary, it slides down on its own, sticking to your ribs like edible paste. You pause, waiting for some burst of flavor that never comes. Still, it's filling, steady, grounding. You imagine yourself heading out to a day of fieldwork after this bowl and realize, yes, it would keep you going, even if your taste buds filed an official complaint. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries flavored lentil porridge with fennel or mint, herbs thought to ease digestion. Others tossed in garlic, which monks alternately praised as a medicinal wonder or condemned as too stimulating for a spiritual life. Imagine garlic being called sinful, it's enough to make you laugh into your bowl. Historians still argue whether garlic and onions were considered distractions to chastity, or just indigestion waiting to happen. Either way, a whiff of garlic breath during silent prayer probably didn't make you popular. You glance around as the other monks eat. No chatter, no giggles at the porridge's sludge-like texture, just calm spoonfuls, each motion identical, like a choir eating in perfect unison. The only sounds are the scrape of wood against clay and the faint hiss of the fire. You realize how different this is from your own rushed mornings, when breakfast is usually a multitasking act, scrolling emails with one hand, shoveling cereal with the other. Here, the slowness feels deliberate, almost heavy. But don't be fooled into thinking porridge was entirely grim. On feast days, the bowl might be sprinkled with a dash of saffron, or cooked in almond milk, turning sludge into something surprisingly rich. Imagine a monk's joy at seeing his usual beige stew glow golden, like winning the breakfast lottery. Even if, to your modern eyes, it still looks like medieval oatmeal gone wrong. You scoop another spoonful, warming from the inside out. It may not be gourmet, but it has a certain honesty. Nothing hidden, nothing wasted. Just lentils, water, fire, patience. And as you scrape the last bit from the bowl, you feel ready for the day's labor. Almost. Because in the back of your mind, you're already thinking about the rare mornings when the porridge might be replaced, or at least joined, by something more exciting: eggs. The morning light slants higher through the narrow windows as you set aside your empty porridge bowl, stomach anchored by lentils but spirit quietly craving more. The monks begin filing into the courtyard again, and you hear hushed rustles of anticipation. Today might be a feast day. And on feast days, something rare sometimes appears: eggs. In your world, eggs are a staple, sunny side up, scrambled, poached with a sprinkle of pepper. But here, in the monastery, their luxuries balanced precariously on theology. Mainstream history tells us that the Benedictine rule, the backbone of Western monastic life, discouraged meat from four-legged animals, but eggs occupied an awkward in-between zone. Some monasteries allowed them freely, others strictly rationed them, and still others considered them indulgence disguised as simplicity. Historians still argue whether eggs were seen as too rich, dangerously linked with feasting rather than fasting. You're handed a boiled egg, its shell mottled, its size smaller than you'd expect, closer to a bantam egg than a supermarket dozen. You crack it gently on the wooden table. The shell splinters, flaking under your thumb. Steam escapes, carrying that familiar sulfurous scent, and suddenly you're transported. For the first time this morning, something smells exactly the same across centuries. You peel it slowly, careful not to lose a shred of white, because every bite is precious. You taste. The yolk is firm, chalky but rich, the white slightly rubbery. Nothing extraordinary, and yet, after days of crusts and beans, it feels decadent. You close your eyes, savoring the buttery weight of it on your tongue, imagining how a monk must have felt on Easter morning when the fast finally broke, and eggs reappeared as a symbol of life reborn. That symbolism wasn't lost on them. Eggs were more than breakfast, they were theology you could eat. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries actually dyed eggs with onion skins or herbs, not just for celebration but to make them last longer, like medieval meal prep. And yes, there's evidence of monks using egg yolks to illuminate manuscripts, literally painting their prayers with breakfast. You picture a brother cracking open a shell, half the yolk for the scribe's palate, half for his growling stomach. Efficiency, cloister style. Around you, the monks eat their eggs in silence, faces calm, hands deliberate. No ketchup bottles, no buttered toast on the side, no banter about who gets the runniest yolk. Just the quiet act of eating, wrapped in layers of symbolism and discipline. You chew your last bite, yolk dry on your tongue, and swallow it down with a sip of water. Not luxurious, but somehow triumphant. And as the bell sounds again, calling the brothers onward, you wonder, are we the ones who've overcomplicated eggs? Omelets with 20 toppings, bacon on the side, hash browns drowning in oil. The monks had just one, boiled and plain, and it carried as much meaning as a banquet plate. Maybe the difference isn't in the egg, but in the way it's eaten, slowly, gratefully, with patience. You step into the crisp air once more, belly carrying bread, lentils, and now an egg that feels heavier than its size. And already, the rhythm of monastic life presses forward. The next bell will summon you not to feast, but to the sea's bounty, salted fish, the Friday standard. A meal that promises preservation, protein, and a jaw workout you'll never forget. The bell tolls again, and you find yourself herded toward another long wooden table, this time not for bread or porridge, but for the monk's most predictable companion, fish. It's Friday, the day when meat is forbidden, yet protein is still required. For centuries, the answer has been the sea, dragged inland one salted hunk at a time. On the table before you lies a platter of preserved fish, stiff as driftwood, each piece shining faintly with salt crystals. You pick one up, small, leathery, pungent, and suddenly you understand why medieval monks probably had very strong opinions about chewing. Salt fish isn't food so much as an ordeal. Still, the brothers handle it with calm determination, breaking pieces with their hands, dipping them in bowls of water to soften the flesh, then gnawing slowly. Mainstream historians note that salted herring, cod, and sometimes eel were the staples of monastery diets on fasting days. They could be shipped inland in barrels, packed so tightly with salt that they'd last months. In some abbeys, fish ponds were dug right inside the cloister walls to guarantee supply. meaning monks became accidental aquaculturists long before the term existed. Imagine little moats teeming with carp, more practical than decorative. You bite in. The flesh is tough, stringy, and tastes like seawater condensed into jerky. It clings to your teeth, demanding patience, and you realize this is breakfast as exercise. Your jaw works harder than your stomach. And yet, there's satisfaction here. The protein settles quickly, and the salt shocks your senses awake in ways barley bread never could. Historians still argue whether the heavy reliance on fish was nutritionally ideal or if it left monks bloated and thirsty. Whatever the truth, you gulp your water greedily after every mouthful, grateful for the relief. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries found loopholes in the fasting rules by classifying aquatic creatures as not meat. This included, famously, beavers. Yes, at least one monastic chronicle insists the beaver's tail counted as fish, meaning it could be eaten on Fridays. Imagine the theological gymnastics involved in turning a beaver into seafood. And if you're giggling now, you're not alone. The monks eat their fish without complaint, hands steady, eyes forward. No lemon wedges, no tartar sauce, no Friday fish fry jokes. Just the steady rhythm of gnawing, chewing, swallowing. You find yourself oddly soothed by the monotony, each bite an act of endurance, each swallow a step toward discipline. And as you finish your portion, tongue still tingling with salt, you think about modern breakfasts, buttery salmon bagels, sushi rolls, avocado toast with smoked trout. Luxuries stacked on luxuries. Compared to those, this salted chunk feels primitive. Yet it also feels pure. No frills, no distractions. Just sea, salt, and survival. The bell rings again, pulling you from your reverie. You rise with the others, stomach heavy but steady, and head toward the gardens. After fish, after salt, after chewing that could crack molars, what could possibly come next? Something gentler, greener, plucked from the monastery's soil, onions, leeks, cabbages, the humble garden greens that filled out every breakfast table when nothing else could. You step out into the monastery gardens, a place that feels more alive than any refectory or chapel. Rows of leeks stand tall like green spears, onions peek from the soil with papery skins, and hardy cabbages curl inward like monks at prayer. The air smells of damp earth, herbs, and the faint sweetness of morning dew. Compared to salted fish or barley crusts, this patch of green looks like abundance. The monks bend low, pulling vegetables with practiced ease. Their sandals crunch on gravel paths, their hands smudged with soil. You join them, tugging at a stubborn onion, its roots clinging to the earth as if reluctant to leave. Finally, it pops free, and you hold it up, its skin flaking, its scent pungent enough to make your eyes sting. Not glamorous, but nourishing. Mainstream history tells us monastery gardens were meticulously planned. Leeks, onions, turnips, and cabbages formed the backbone of daily meals. These vegetables were cheap, hearty, and most importantly, they grew in every season if managed well. For monks, who were expected to live from the land, greens weren't garnish, they were survival. You carry your harvest to the kitchen, where cauldrons already bubble. A monk chops onions with a knife so dull it's practically a spoon, tossing the pieces into the pot with barley and beans. The smell fills the air, sharp and earthy, and your stomach perks up. Compared to salted fish jerky, even onion soup feels luxurious. You dip your spoon in later, tasting the broth, light, thin, but tinged with a sweetness that surprises you. It's humble, but somehow comforting, like a medieval miso. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries believed onions had protective powers, not just nutritional value. They were worn around the neck to ward off illness, rubbed on doorways to repel evil, even tucked under pillows to cure sleeplessness. Imagine a dormitory full of monks snoring with onions under their heads. It's both comical and strangely practical. Historians still argue whether these practices were symbolic or sincerely medicinal, but either way, onions were the Swiss Army knife of the cloister garden. You look at your bowl again, sipping slowly. The vegetables might be simple, but they balance the heaviness of bread and the saltiness of fish. And the sheer variety, greens, roots, herbs, keeps monotony at bay. In your modern life, you might overlook leeks or cabbage as side dishes, but here they stand at center stage, stars of the breakfast table. Around you, monks slurp quietly, steam rising from bowls, faces softened by warmth. The silence is companionable now, less heavy than before. Eating from the same pot, drinking from the same well, living by the same rules, this is community etched in flavor. You're struck by how much a shared onion soup can mean when you've surrendered every other indulgence. As you finish, wiping your mouth on the back of your sleeve like everyone else, you notice the herb patch nearby. Mint, sage, fennel, leaves not for meals but for brewing. Breakfast isn't done yet. A bitter, steaming draft waits in the cloister kitchens, one that might not excite your taste buds but promises to soothe your stomach. The monks call it medicine, you'll soon know it as their morning brew. The clatter of bowls fades, and once again you follow the current of monks as they drift toward a side chamber near the gardens. The air here is heavy with sharper scents, not bread or onions this time, but leaves crushed, roots dried, herbs steeping in clay pots. A low steam rises from cauldrons, filling the space with a mix of bitterness and promise. This is the apothecary's corner, where breakfast blends into medicine, herbal infusions for stomach, spirit, and discipline. A brother stirs one pot with a wooden ladle, his face impassive as the liquid bubbles. The smell is pungent, grassy, almost sour. You squint at the floating leaves, fennel, maybe mint, maybe something you don't recognize at all. Mainstream history tells us monasteries kept extensive herb gardens, not only for cooking but for healing. Sage, mint, rue, and wormwood were staples. Some were drunk to ease digestion after heavy bread, others to calm fevers, and a few probably did nothing except make your face pucker. You're handed a cup, warm against your fingers. You sip cautiously, and the taste hits, bitter, earthy, slightly sweet at the edges. It's not unpleasant, but it's not exactly the morning latte you crave either. The bitterness sharpens your tongue, clears your head in a way that almost feels like punishment. The monks don't flinch, they drink steadily, as if the taste itself is part of the discipline. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries use these herbs as mild laxatives, meaning that a cup of morning brew might guarantee more than just clarity. Imagine the shared silence in the refectory followed by a suspicious shuffle of sandals down the corridor. Historians still argue whether such infusions were genuinely effective medicine or simply ritual, placebo wrapped in holy intent. But one thing's certain, the monks believed these brews kept body and soul aligned, each sip both physical cure and spiritual metaphor. You take another sip, grimacing slightly. The bitterness sits on your tongue like an uninvited guest, and yet, it's strangely grounding. The taste forces you to slow down, to acknowledge what you're consuming. No gulping, no distraction, just you and the plant's sharp reminder that health sometimes comes in unpleasant packages. You think about your own mornings, espresso shots, energy drinks, sugary teas, and wonder if bitterness isn't what your body needed all along. The room grows quiet except for the faint bubbling of pots. Brothers sit along the benches, cups cradled in their hands, eyes half shut in meditation. The steam drifts upward, curling in the cool air like incense in liquid form. You sip slowly, adjusting, until the bitterness becomes almost tolerable, maybe even calming. By the time you finish, the cup is empty but your stomach feels steadier, less rebellious. There's no caffeine buzz, no sugar rush, just a quiet sense of having done something purposeful. You stand with the others, placing the clay cup back on the shelf. Another bell echoes faintly from the courtyard, a reminder that even this herbal pause has its place in the rhythm of the day. And now, as you follow the monks back into the sunlight, you notice a different kind of jug waiting near the doorway. Not water, not herbs. The liquid glints pale amber, faintly foamy at the edges. This time, it's ale, weak, mild, but a staple in more monasteries than you'd expect. Breakfast beer, they called it, though you might just call it history's strangest morning pick-me-up. You pause at the threshold where the morning light spills onto rows of jugs, their clay sides sweating faintly from the coolness within. A brother lifts one and pours out a thin amber stream into wooden cups. It foams weakly at the edges, more like tired soap bubbles than a frothy pint. This is not the ale of tavern songs or roaring feasts. This is small beer, a breakfast companion for monks, peasants, and just about anyone who wanted hydration without gambling on waterborne illness. You take the cup, sniff cautiously. The smell is faintly sour, bready, with a ghost of hops. You sip, and it tastes like barley tea that lost a fight, watery, slightly tangy, almost flat. Yet it's safe. Mainstream historical accounts confirm that small beer contained less than 1 to 2% alcohol, not enough to intoxicate but enough to keep bacteria at bay. In a world where streams carried who knows what, this brew was a safer bet. The monks drink it steadily, unbothered, as if it's no stranger than water. For them, ale wasn't indulgence, it was hydration dressed in barley. And here's your quirky tidbit: records show that some abbeys brewed their own, producing gallons daily, not for feasting but for survival. In fact, some monasteries became famous for their brewing skills, with recipes that would later evolve into the beers still brewed by Trappist monks today. You sip again, thinking that what you're tasting now is the distant ancestor of a modern craft beer, though nobody back then was bragging about notes of citrus or hints of oak. Historians still argue whether small beer made monks healthier or simply dulled their thirst. Some claim it provided steady calories, others argue it left them sluggish. You look around at the brothers, their faces serene, their hands steady on cups, and it seems clear that this weak brew was never meant for pleasure. It was practical, unpretentious, liquid bread in its mildest form. You drink the last of your cup, lips tinged with the faint tang of barley. You don't feel lighter or heavier, just steadier. And in that steadiness you realize, this was the medieval version of coffee. Not because it woke anyone up, but because it was a ritual, a shared start, a way to anchor the morning together. As the monks set down their cups, you hear a faint lowing from beyond the cloister walls. Cows. The sound drifts in soft and mournful, reminding you that while small beer filled one niche, milk filled another. But milk was even more controversial than ale, because in some monasteries, it was welcome nourishment, while in others it was a scandal in a cup. And that's where your path leads next, the complicated, curdled history of monks and milk. The lowing grows louder as you cross the courtyard, the smell of hay and warm animals drifting on the morning air. A small herd of cows grazes beyond the cloister wall, their heavy bodies moving slowly, bells clanking with a sleepy rhythm. You realize that while bread and beer might form the backbone of monastic diets, milk offered something richer: protein, fat, comfort. Yet its place at the breakfast table was far from simple. A novice carries a wooden pail toward the kitchen, foam sloshing at the rim. Fresh milk, still warm, almost steaming in the chill air. You lean closer, half expecting to be handed a cup. But not so fast. Mainstream history points out that many monastic rules treated milk as suspiciously indulgent, especially in its fresh form. Was it food for workers in the fields? Or was it a luxury that distracted from the ascetic ideal? Historians still argue whether milk was accepted in moderation or frowned upon as a slippery slope toward gluttony. You're finally offered a small portion, and you sip. It's thick, richer than any modern carton, unpasteurized and faintly grassy. The taste is startling, alive, almost wild, with a sweetness that feels too comforting for a place built on restraint. Compared to barley bread, this is velvet. Compared to small beer, this is decadence. You imagine some monks savoring it with guilty pleasure, while others muttered about temptation and discipline slipping away. Here's your quirky tidbit: in some monasteries, milk was considered acceptable only when transformed into butter or cheese. Fresh milk was too unstable, too quick to sour, and perhaps too close to indulgence. Butter could be rationed, cheese stored, but milk in its raw state was fleeting, almost frivolous. Which explains why some monks treated it like a scandal. Imagine whispering in the cloister, Brother Benedict had 2 cups of milk this morning. You picture your modern breakfasts, lattes, smoothies, bowls of cereal swimming in milk, and laugh quietly. What monks saw as excess, you see as normal. And yet, maybe they had a point. Milk is heavy, filling, comforting in a way that threatens to lull the spirit into complacency. After all, the goal here wasn't comfort. It was discipline. The cows flicked their tails, indifferent to these theological debates, as if to say, drink, don't drink, we'll keep chewing. You hand back the empty cup, your stomach warm, your tongue coated in cream. The experience leaves you thoughtful, nourished, yes, but also slightly guilty, as though you've stolen something meant for feast days. The bell tolls again, sharper this time, reminding you that indulgence has its limits. Ahead lies the season when all comfort is pared back, when even milk and cheese are banished from the table. The long weeks of Lent, when breakfast shrinks to crumbs and survival leans heavily on faith, fasting, and the stubborn resilience of the human stomach. The bell's echo feels heavier this time, almost as if it's reminding you of what's about to vanish. The cows, the honey, the eggs, all the little sparks of comfort, fade into the distance as the calendar slides into Lent. For 40 days, the monastery bends itself into sharper discipline, and breakfast becomes a shadow of what it was. You shuffle back into the refectory, the familiar long table stretching ahead. The baskets of bread arrive, but the loaves look smaller, the crusts thinner, almost apologetic. Lent pares things down to essentials: barley bread, water, maybe a spoon of beans or lentils if the abbot is merciful. No cheese, no milk, certainly no eggs. Even fish, sometimes permitted on fasting days, is banished in stricter houses. What remains is plain, relentless simplicity. You tear your crust, chew slowly, and feel the emptiness still echoing inside. Mainstream historians tell us Lent was not just about abstaining from certain foods, but also from quantity. Smaller portions, fewer meals, a gnawing hunger meant to sharpen spiritual focus. The idea was that each growl of the stomach tethered you back to prayer. Historians still argue whether this strengthened monks' devotion or simply wore their bodies thin. You sip water, its coolness both refreshing and disappointing. You imagine the other brothers, each one quietly measuring his own weakness against the discipline demanded. The silence here is different, it's heavier, less companionable, more strained. Hunger sharpens the edges of the room, makes every sound louder, the scrape of bread against teeth, the faint cough of a brother swallowing nothing at all. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries replaced meat, milk, and eggs with almond milk during Lent. Yes, medieval almond milk, made by grinding almonds into water, was common in wealthier abbeys, a workaround that kept meals rich without technically breaking fast rules. But in humbler houses like this one, almonds were a rarity. Your cup remains filled only with water, plain and cold. You chew again, slowly, and you realize how different hunger feels in silence. At home, you might grab a snack without thought. Here, every bite is deliberate, and every missing bite is even more deliberate. The discipline presses in from all sides. You glance around and see no complaints, no furtive glances for extra food. Just acceptance. And yet, as you swallow the last crumb, your body protests, whispering about all the calories you're not getting. How will you copy manuscripts with steady hands? How will you labor in the fields? The monks believed the answer lay in balance, that emptiness of stomach-filled space for God. Whether you believe that or not, the discipline is undeniable. You leave the refectory, step slower, head slightly light. The morning air feels sharper on your skin, the sky brighter, almost harsh. You wonder if the hunger itself changes the way you perceive the world: colors too sharp, sounds too loud, senses a little unsteady. And ahead, waiting with its ink-stained pages, lies the cloister rulebook, spelling out in painstaking detail exactly what you may and may not eat, and when. The monks lived by these rules, and breakfast was shaped entirely by them. The rules are everywhere, carved not in stone but in memory, murmured through generations of monks who lived and died by them. You step into the cloister library, shelves stacked with parchment rolls and bound manuscripts, and here you find the backbone of monastic eating, the rule of Saint Benedict. Written in the 6th century, it still governs the table centuries later. And at breakfast, you feel its hand most of all. You trace your fingers over the Latin lines, the ink faded but the meaning firm. Benedict's rule is clear: no meat from four-legged animals, 2 meals a day in ordinary seasons, 1 during fasts. But like all rules, the devil, or perhaps the divine, is in the details. How much bread? How much drink? The text specifies a pound of bread per day, split across meals, and a modest measure of wine or ale. Yet nothing is left vague by accident. Monks measured food the way scribes measured lines of text, precisely. At breakfast, this meant portioned loaves, exact slices of cheese, carefully counted eggs. Mainstream historians point out that such regulation wasn't just about discipline, but also fairness. No monk could slip into luxury while another starved. Food was the great equalizer, even when the portions left your stomach arguing otherwise. Historians still debate whether this strict uniformity truly built community or whether it quietly fueled resentment among hungrier brothers. You imagine the abbot overseeing meals, eyes sharp as a hawk's, making sure nobody sneaks a larger piece of bread. Perhaps Brother Matthew, taller than the rest, longed for just 1 extra crust. Perhaps Brother Peter, frielier, dreaded even the small portion. Yet all were expected to endure equally. Hunger was not a personal trial but a communal one, shared across the benches of the refectory. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries created elaborate charts for portion sizes, with tables indicating allowances for different feast days, fasts, and work levels. It's the medieval equivalent of a calorie tracking app, but with ink and parchment instead of glowing screens. Imagine the scribe sighing as he inked out, on Saint So-and-so's day, add 2 ounces of cheese. A kind of divine nutrition log. You sit again at the refectory table in your mind, chewing that carefully weighed crust. The difference between too much and too little isn't left to chance, it's written, measured, enforced. And yet, the human spirit always looks for loopholes. You can feel it even now, that tension between obedience and appetite. If the rules say, no meat, does that mean no meat ever? Or could some creative thinking slip a little flesh onto the table? As you close the manuscript, the candlelight flickering across its pages, you hear the murmur of sandals outside. It seems you're not the only one wondering. Loopholes were not theoretical, they were very real, and breakfast sometimes tasted of them. Next, you'll step into that gray area, where monks found ways to sneak indulgence past the written word, and meat, against all odds, found its way back into the cloister bowls. You step out of the library with the words of Saint Benedict echoing in your ears: no meat from four-legged animals, moderation in all things, discipline above appetite. Yet as you follow the monks toward the kitchen again, you catch whispers, small hints of something less austere. Because where there are rules, there are always loopholes. And when it came to meat, medieval monks were as inventive as any lawyer. The first loophole is simple: birds. Chickens, geese, ducks, they technically aren't four-legged. So while oxen, pigs, and sheep were off the table, poultry sometimes slipped on, especially during feast days or when the abbot allowed extra strength for sick brothers. Mainstream history confirms that some abbeys even raised their own poultry flocks, tucked behind garden walls. You picture a monk tiptoeing out to gather eggs and maybe, just maybe, carrying back a plump chicken when no one was watching too closely. Then there's the famous fish loophole. We've already seen salted herring at the table, but some monasteries stretch the definition of fish with breathtaking creativity. Beavers, for instance, historians still argue over the logic, but the beaver's tail, scaly and aquatic, was classified as fish. So yes, on fasting Fridays, a monk might gnaw a beaver tail with complete theological confidence. If that image makes you smile, you're not alone. But breakfast meat sometimes came in even stranger disguises. Here's your quirky tidbit: in certain abbeys, broth made from boiled meat bones was considered acceptable, since it wasn't technically meat. Imagine a steaming bowl of liquid that tastes like beef stew but gets a holy stamp of approval because it's thin enough to pass as drink. A sly, spoon-shaped wink at the rules. You sit at the refectory table and are handed a small bowl of something richer than usual. It smells faintly of broth, warm and savory, the kind of scent that makes your stomach leap like a choir hitting its high note. You sip, and the flavor is undeniably meaty. Not flesh, not solid food, but the ghost of it, warmth carried in liquid. You realize how skillfully monks blurred lines, how hunger and ingenuity turned rules into riddles. Historians still argue whether abbots turned blind eyes to these practices or whether monks genuinely believed they were staying faithful. Perhaps both. Discipline required structure, but survival demanded flexibility. And so the cloister kitchen became a stage for quiet negotiations, where a broth might be watered enough to count as lawful, and where meat, in whispers and shadows, kept sneaking its way back to the morning table. As you drain the last of your broth, warmth spreading through your belly, you catch the faintest whiff of something exotic, spices, sharp and sweet. It's a scent utterly out of place in this austere hall, and yet it drifts closer, carried from the pantry where jars of faraway lands rest in secret. Because even monks, disciplined and obedient, were not immune to the allure of imported wonders. Cinnamon, pepper, maybe even ginger, ingredients that could transform even the plainest porridge into something unforgettable. The scent lingers long after the broth bowls are cleared, curling in the air like a secret. At first, you think you've imagined it. How could pepper, cinnamon, or cloves possibly find their way into a cloister breakfast? Yet when you follow the trail into the pantry, there they are, small jars, sealed tight, tucked among sacks of barley and dried beans. Spices, glimmering like contraband treasures. A brother opens one jar and the fragrance bursts out, sharp and sweet, filling the stone room with a warmth that feels almost decadent. Pepper grains, black and wrinkled, sit like tiny gems. Cinnamon curls in brittle rolls, a color too rich for this plain world. You lean closer, inhaling, and for a moment you forget the chill of the monastery. It's as if your senses have been transported to distant markets on the silk routes, where traders carried these wonders across deserts and seas. Mainstream historians confirm that medieval monasteries did use spices, though sparingly. They were expensive, often donated by wealthy patrons or acquired through trade networks stretching far beyond the cloister walls. When they appeared at breakfast, it wasn't to drown food in luxury, it was to stretch tiny pinches into symbolic power. A dash of cinnamon in porridge, a sprinkle of pepper on lentils, enough to remind the monks of a world wider than their stone walls. You're handed a small bowl of barley gruel, steam rising faintly. This time, instead of the usual bland heaviness, you notice flecks of dark pepper floating on top. You take a cautious bite, and the difference is startling. The pepper stings your tongue, wakes your mouth, transforms the ordinary mush into something that almost feels modern. You laugh quietly. It's not much, but after days of dullness, even a pinch of spice feels like a party. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries actually debated whether using spices was sinful. Were they necessary nourishment, or a frivolous indulgence? Pepper in particular sparked heated arguments. After all, it was imported at great cost, and wasn't salt enough for seasoning. Historians still argue whether abbots turned a blind eye when monks sprinkled their porridge or if they cracked down with severity, forbidding what they saw as vanity of the palate. You sit with the monks, each of you spooning spiced porridge in silence. The quiet is still intact, but the atmosphere feels different, lighter, almost amused, as though everyone senses they're indulging just a little more than the rules intended. The cinnamon, when it appears on feast days, is even more magical, sweet, fragrant, like sunlight folded into food. You close your eyes as you imagine it, and for once you don't feel deprived. But the bell rings again, and just as quickly the magic dissolves. The bowls are cleared, the jars return to their shelves, the pantry door shut tight. Spices vanish back into mystery, their glimmers of warmth sealed away until the next feast or donation. You stand, stomach buzzing faintly from the pepper spark, and step back into the stone corridors. Ahead lies not another meal but another rhythm, the morning's labor. Work in the fields, scribal desks, or kitchens. And as you walk, you realize breakfast is not the end of the story, it's only the prelude. The bell will soon summon you to toil, your stomach fueled by barley, lentils, maybe a touch of pepper, as you bend into the long day. The bell rings with a firmer tone now, not calling you to prayer or to table, but to work. Breakfast, such as it was, bread, lentils, maybe a hint of pepper, is finished, and now the day demands payment for those few calories. You follow the monks out to the fields beyond the cloister walls, where mist clings to the ground and the sun, still shy, glows pale behind clouds. The garden tools lean against a wall, hoes, spades, sickles worn smooth by years of hands gripping wood. You take one, feeling the rough grain beneath your fingers, and step onto the soil. The ground is damp, soft underfoot, ready to be turned. The monks spread out in silence, rows of brown robes bending like reeds in the morning breeze. No chatter, no complaints, just the steady rhythm of work, punctuated by the caw of crows overhead. Your stomach, though, still notices its state. The bread sits heavy, the lentils slower to digest, but already you feel the gnaw of effort. Mainstream historians tell us that monasteries were self-sufficient by design, every monk was expected to labor, not just pray. Agriculture was central, vegetable gardens, orchards, vineyards, even fish ponds. Breakfast was fuel for this work, not indulgence. Historians still argue whether the diet provided enough calories for the grueling physical labor or whether monks regularly skirted hunger's edge. You bend low, pulling weeds from between leek stalks, the smell of onion sharp in the morning air. Sweat begins to bead at your temples, your stomach reminding you of how modest the refectory portions truly were. And here's your quirky tidbit, some monasteries assign specific breakfast extras, an extra hunk of bread, a slice of cheese, to brothers doing the hardest labor. Fieldwork might earn you what amounted to a monastic snack pack, though never anything resembling luxury. The silence of the field is broken only by the scrape of hoes and the low sigh of wind. You realize the rhythm of this labor mirrors the rhythm of breakfast itself, repetitive, steady, deliberate. No rush, no multitasking. Just one action after another, like a prayer performed with hands instead of lips. Even hunger becomes part of the pattern, humming in the background, reminding you to pace yourself. You pause, leaning on your spade, and glance at the other monks. Their faces are calm, sweat tracing down foreheads, movement steady as clockwork. There's a strange serenity here, you work until your body aches, but the monotony lulls the mind. It's almost meditative. Your empty stomach, which earlier felt distracting, now blends into the rhythm, a quiet echo that sharpens your awareness of every motion. The sun climbs higher, the mist lifting to reveal rows of cabbages, apple trees budding in the distance, and beehives buzzing with life. All these, you realize, will circle back to the breakfast table in one form or another, vegetables, fruits, honey, herbs. The monastery is a closed loop, every bite tied to someone's labor. When the bell finally tolls again, calling you away from the fields, you feel both drained and oddly steady. The bread and lentils have burned through you like kindling, but your mind feels sharpened, your spirit calmed by the rhythm. Ahead lies not the field but the scriptorium, where monks bend over parchment, quills scratching, hunger hovering like a quiet companion. And there, you'll see how even the memory of breakfast shaped the way words were written onto vellum. The bell pulls you from the field soil to the scriptorium's silence, a different kind of labor now awaiting. You step into the long, narrow hall, lit by slanted shafts of light that cut across rows of desks. The smell here is not onions or damp earth but parchment, ink, and faint candle wax. Monks sit hunched over their work, quills scratching steadily, the only sound softer than breath. You take your place at a desk, a sheet of vellum before you, a quill trimmed sharp, a pot of ink dark as midnight. The weight of breakfast, or rather, the lack of it, presses on your mind. Your stomach is quiet now, not growling, but hollow, and you wonder whether hunger makes the hand steadier or shakier. Mainstream historians note that monastic scribes often worked for hours without break, copying texts line by line. Food was never abundant, but it was just enough to sustain the focus required to produce entire libraries of knowledge. You dip the quill, begin to write, the scratch echoing faintly. Each stroke demands patience. And patience, perhaps, is exactly what a thin breakfast trains into you. Some scholars argue that hunger heightened awareness, narrowing the mind's distractions like blinders on a horse. Others suggest it dulled the senses, making mistakes more likely. Historians still debate whether a half-empty stomach helped or hindered monastic productivity. Looking at your wavering lines, you suspect the answer might depend on the day. Here's your quirky tidbit: some manuscripts contain faint smudges and grease marks, evidence that monks occasionally ate while copying. Imagine a crumb of barley bread tumbling onto sacred text, or a drop of lentil porridge staining the edge of a prayer. Even in the silence of the scriptorium, breakfast left its fingerprints. You glance down the row, seeing the faces of brothers bent in concentration. One rubs his forehead, fighting fatigue, another pauses, eyes half shut, perhaps silently praying for strength, or for lunch to come faster. And yet the work continues, line after line, as though each word written is an act of endurance, fueled by nothing more than crusts, beans, and sheer willpower. The candle beside you flickers, and your eyes sting. Hunger hums faintly in the background, not loud enough to distract fully but enough to make you aware of your own body, the stiffness of your spine, the twitch of your fingers, the weight of your eyelids. Still, you push forward. Writing becomes a rhythm, much like weeding the fields or chewing stale bread. Each letter is a step closer to the end of the page, each page a step closer to preserving knowledge for centuries to come. You pause, stretch your hands, and let your eyes wander to the shelves where finished volumes rest. Some are illuminated with gold, vibrant pigments glowing even in dim light. You imagine the monks who painted them, dipping brushes into egg yolk tempera, their breakfasts literally fused into art. The connection between hunger and beauty feels ironic, but maybe that tension is exactly what gave their work its brilliance. The bell tolls again, a soft note reminding you that time has passed. You set down your quill, rub your tired hands, and feel the hunger stir once more. Breakfast is long gone now, burned through ink and prayer, and your body whispers for more. You wonder if the brothers ever sneaked a bite between bells, an apple, a nut, a crumb hidden in their robes. And as you leave the scriptorium, your thoughts turn to that possibility: did monks secretly snack, or was the discipline too strong to allow such small rebellions? You step back into the cloister walk, sunlight now fully spilling into the courtyard, your head heavy from copying and your stomach gnawing again. The idea takes root in your mind: did any monk ever sneak food between bells? Surely not all were saints of restraint. You glance toward the orchard beyond the walls, where branches bend gently under the weight of apples, pears, maybe even plums. It would be so easy to slip one into a sleeve. Mainstream accounts admit that while monastic rules were strict, human nature was equally persistent. Some chronicles record infractions of brothers nibbling outside the designated hours, though rarely with drama, more like a quiet note in the abbot's log. And yes, historians still argue whether casual snacking was widespread or rare, but the silence of such records might just mean abbots preferred not to publicize how many apples went missing. You imagine yourself as Brother Sneaky, robe concealing a small apple, fingers itching to take a bite in some quiet corner. The taste would be a revelation: sweet, juicy, a burst of sugar in a diet ruled by starch and salt. Here's your quirky tidbit: some abbeys planted orchards specifically for collations, light snacks taken during certain hours, often fruit or nuts, meant to ease study or prayer. But those were structured allowances, not sneaky indulgence. The blurred line between snack and sin depended entirely on how the abbot read the rules. You picture monks walking the garden paths, hands folded neatly, sleeves hiding apples or pears like contraband. A crunch in the wrong place could give you away. The cloister is quiet enough that the sound of teeth-breaking fruit might echo louder than a bell. The risk adds humor to the thought: discipline tested not by feasts but by the smallest of temptations, a single bite of sweetness. And yet, perhaps it wasn't rebellion at all. Maybe snacking was survival. Field labor, long hours of copying, fasting seasons. It's not hard to imagine brothers quietly justifying a stolen pear as fuel for the soul. Historians still argue whether abbots tolerated such slips, turning a blind eye for the sake of their monks' health, or cracked down with penances as sharp as hunger itself. You reach up in your imagination, pluck an apple, polish it against your sleeve. The skin shines red and green, crisp in your palm. You bite, juice running down your chin, and it feels like breaking a law and finding heaven in the same moment. Compared to the dry bread and lentils, this is luxury beyond measure. The thought lingers as the bell rings again, calling you not to food this time, but to midday prayer. Your body is reminded once more that breakfast is over, that indulgence must wait, that silence and discipline come first. Still, you carry the phantom sweetness of that apple with you, tucked in your mind like a secret. And as you step back toward the chapel, you begin to wonder, if you measured a monk's breakfast against your modern bowl of cereal or stack of pancakes, how would the calories compare? Did their sparse diet actually sustain them better than our sugar-crashing mornings, or are you romanticizing hunger? The bell fades behind you, but the question sticks like porridge: how does a monk's breakfast actually stack up to yours? You imagine laying two plates side by side, one with a monk's ration of barley bread, maybe a spoon of lentils or an egg on a feast day, and the other with your bowl of frosted cereal or buttered toast. Which one truly carries more energy? Which one lasts longer before hunger strikes again? You sit on a worn bench in the cloister walk, mentally tallying numbers as if you're the monastery's own dietitian. Mainstream historians estimate a monk's daily bread ration at about £1, split between meals. At breakfast, that might mean 4 or 5 ounces of dense, whole-grain barley loaf. That's roughly 300 to 400 calories, not glamorous, but solid fuel. Add a small portion of lentils, another 100 calories, or on lucky days, a boiled egg at 70. In all, breakfast might hover between 400 and 600 calories. Compare that to your modern morning: a sugary cereal can hit 200 calories before you've even added milk, and a generous pour doubles it. A buttered bagel? 400 to 500 calories easily. Toss in coffee with cream, and you're already past what the monks consumed, though with far less fiber and far more sugar. Historians still argue whether the monk's diet, though small, provided steadier energy precisely because it was slow to digest: whole grains, legumes, no refined sugar spikes. Here's your quirky tidbit: archaeological analysis of medieval latrines shows that monks ate astonishing amounts of fiber. Enough that modern nutritionists would blink. The barley bread and bean stews left them, let's just say, remarkably regular. Their breakfasts, while humble, acted like digestive metronomes, keeping everything on schedule, which may explain why monks often lived surprisingly long lives for their era. You take a slow breath, imagining how a crust of barley bread, though tasteless, might keep you upright through hours of labor. Your modern cereal, by contrast, might leave you crashing mid-morning, hunting for a snack. You start to wonder whether the monks, in their simplicity, stumbled onto something that dietitians still preach today: eat whole, eat slow, eat less sugar. The thought lingers as you watch the brothers moving across the courtyard, their steps measured, their energy steady but not exuberant. They don't look wired like coffee drinkers or sluggish like someone coming down from syrup. They look balanced, as if their bodies had learned to stretch every crumb across hours of chanting, farming, copying. Your stomach murmurs faintly again, and you chuckle to yourself. Yes, you've tallied the calories, done the mental math, but numbers don't fully quiet hunger. And that leads to your next wondering: if the monks lived on beans, bread, eggs, and the occasional fish, how did their protein stack up against your bacon and omelette mornings? Were they stronger for it, or did their simple diets leave them frail under all that discipline? You rise from the bench and drift toward the garden wall, thoughts still circling like bees over honeycomb: protein. The modern breakfast plate in your mind gleams with bacon, eggs, maybe yogurt, a protein shake if you're feeling ambitious. But the monks? Their plates leaned on beans, lentils, fish, and the occasional egg. Was it enough to keep them strong, or were they walking a fine line between endurance and exhaustion? Mainstream historians point out that legumes were the unsung heroes of the cloister. Lentils, peas, broad beans, all packed with protein, all cheap to grow, all permitted under fasting rules. A bowl of lentil porridge might carry 8 or 9 grams of protein, not far from an egg, though without the same richness. Add bread, also a modest protein source, and the numbers add up more quickly than you'd expect. And then there's fish, salted, dried, or fresh from cloister ponds, an undeniable boost to the protein ledger. You imagine a monk spooning lentils, then chewing salted herring until his jaw aches, and you start to see it, not glamorous, not excessive, but steady. Historians still argue whether this humble protein strategy produced healthier bodies than the meat-heavy diets of nobles. Nobles feasted on venison and pork, but often struggled with gout and other illnesses of excess. Monks, meanwhile, kept working into old age, their simpler diets fueling bodies tuned more for endurance than indulgence. Here's your quirky tidbit: some monasteries even allowed sick brothers extra protein rations, including meat broth or extra eggs. But sick was sometimes interpreted generously. After all, who doesn't feel mysteriously frail when an extra egg is on the line? Records show abbots occasionally scolded monks for claiming illness a little too conveniently, like medieval excuses for a bigger breakfast. You lean against the wall, picturing your own bacon and eggs plate beside a monk's lentils and fish. On your side, quick, savory satisfaction, but followed by a heavy slump. On his, slower, steadier energy, perhaps less joy but more balance. Which is healthier? That depends on whether you value pleasure or endurance, indulgence or moderation. The monks nearby continue their chores, muscles lean but not wasted, movements purposeful. You realize that protein here wasn't about bulking up, it was about just enough to work, pray, and keep the rhythm of cloister life. No more, no less. As you push away from the wall, another thought creeps in. Protein may have been steady, but what about sweetness? Where you reach for frosted cereals or sugary pastries, monks had only honey, rare, precious, rationed. Was their world actually healthier for having so little sugar, or did they long for sweetness the way you long for comfort food? The bell calls again, and you know your next lesson lies in the monastery's complicated relationship with sweetness, long before sugar bowls ever sat on breakfast tables. The bell's echo fades into the cloister courtyard, and your thoughts turn from beans and fish to sweetness. Because here's the truth, monks didn't know sugar the way you do. No frosted flakes, no cinnamon rolls, no powdered donuts sitting pretty behind glass. For most of the Middle Ages, sugar was a foreign luxury, something merchants whispered about on the silk routes, a spice more than a staple. If sweetness reached the monastic table at all, it came in the form of honey. You step back into the kitchen where a small jar glimmers like treasure. Golden, sticky, glowing even in dim light, it's the same honey you tasted earlier, only now you understand just how rare it was. A single spoonful might flavor porridge, soften bread, or be stirred into herbal infusions. Mainstream historians confirm that honey was as much medicine as food, prescribed for sore throats, stomach troubles, or simply as a tonic for the weary. A teaspoon here and there, that was the monk's entire allowance of sweetness. You picture yourself with a modern breakfast, 2 glazed donuts, a caramel latte, maybe a splash of orange juice. In a single sitting, you've eaten more sugar than a monk might see in a month. Historians still argue whether the absence of refined sugar truly made medieval diets healthier, or whether the scarcity simply shifted cravings elsewhere. But when you bite into a crust with honey, you feel it, the sharp thrill of sweetness, amplified by deprivation. It's a treat so potent it makes modern desserts seem numb by comparison. Here's your quirky tidbit: some abbeys kept bees not just for honey, but for beeswax, used in candles. The wax lit prayers, while the honey sweetened porridge, a double gift from the hive. And in certain manuscripts, bees themselves were described as holy workers, models of discipline. Imagine monks looking at a buzzing hive and thinking, yes, this is how breakfast and prayer should feel, busy, orderly, sweet in the right measure. You spread a tiny smear of honey on your barley bread and chew. The sweetness hits like lightning against the sour grain, your tongue lighting up, your body sighing with relief. You can almost hear your modern self laugh, 1 teaspoon. That's it. But here, that teaspoon means everything. And as you sit with sticky fingers, you realize the contrast is bigger than sugar alone. Their world rationed sweetness until it was sacred, yours drowns in it until it feels empty. Who's healthier? Who's happier? The answer, like honey itself, is thick, complicated, and a little sticky. The bell tolls again, pulling you forward. Ahead lies another revelation, not sweetness this time, but fiber. Because while you worry about eating enough greens in your diet, monks were practically fiber factories, their bread and beans crammed with bran and husk. And the truth is, that roughage shaped their bodies, and their mornings, in ways you might find both amusing and enlightening. The bell fades, and you wander back toward the refectory where crumbs from breakfast still litter the wooden tables. You notice them more closely this time, hard, gritty flecks of crust, darker than your modern loaf. When you pick one up between your fingers, it scratches your skin like sand. That's when it hits you, monastic bread was loaded with fiber, whether you wanted it or not. Mainstream historians confirm that most cloister bread was made from barley or rye, often ground coarsely with bran intact. No refined white flour, no silky baguette crumbs. Every bite was dense, chewy, and full of husk. Beans, lentils, vegetables, these only added more roughage. The monks weren't counting grams of fiber on the back of a cereal box, they were eating it by default, every single day. And the results? Well, historians still argue whether this constant fiber intake kept monks healthier or just kept them moving. You break a crust open, and the inside looks less like fluffy bread and more like compacted grain. You chew, jaw working hard, and feel it drag slowly through your stomach, filling every corner with its weight. It's not fast food, it's slow food in the truest sense, demanding patience, demanding time. Here's your quirky tidbit, archaeologists studying medieval latrines, yes, even history has those jobs, found astonishing evidence of just how much fiber monks consumed. The remains showed diets so high in bran that digestion must have been as punctual as the monastery's bells. Imagine entire dormitories rising at dawn, not only to pray, but to march in rhythm to the garderobe, stomachs on the same clockwork schedule. You chuckle at the thought, but you also sense the health hiding in the humor. Fiber meant steadier blood sugar, fewer spikes and crashes. No glazed donut jitters, no post-waffle slump. Just long, steady energy. Your modern diet might worship protein shakes and vitamin gummies, but here, fiber was the unsung saint of the cloister table. The monks around you eat their bread in silence, each bite turning into a slow act of endurance. You realize the discipline wasn't only spiritual, it was physical too. Chewing hard bread day after day kept their jaws strong, their bellies full, their digestion steady. Not glamorous, not joyful, but reliable. You lean back, crumbs still on your robe, and let the thought sink in. Maybe their mornings weren't about flavor at all, but about function, food as rhythm, food as fuel. And yet, beneath that function, you can't help but ask, did this austere breakfast actually make monks live longer? Were they healthier than their noble neighbors gorging on meat and sweets? The question lingers as the bell sounds again, pointing you toward the next inquiry, health outcomes, the quiet ledger of what this diet truly bought. The bell calls once more, but this time you feel the question ringing louder than the sound itself, did all these crusts and lentils and salted fish actually add up to health? Were monks, with their austere breakfasts, living longer and sturdier lives than the nobles across the walls who feasted on roast meats, pies, and candied fruits? Mainstream historians give a cautious yes. Records show many monks lived into their 60s or 70s, an impressive span in an age when peasants often didn't see 50. Diet played its part. Whole grains, beans, vegetables, moderate portions, little sugar, modern doctors would approve. Monastic schedules also kept them moving, farming, walking, chanting, writing. Their lives were disciplined, their calories steady, their fiber intake legendary. Yet historians still argue whether this longevity was due to food alone. Monks also had cleaner living conditions than peasants, safer walls, and regular access to basic healthcare, herbs, poultices, and yes, those bitter infusions you tasted earlier. But food mattered. Nobles often died from diseases of excess, gout, obesity, digestive disorders fueled by meat-heavy diets. Monks, by contrast, rarely ate enough to reach such ailments. Hunger, it seems, was its own form of protection. You sit in the cloister garden and imagine two breakfast plates side by side again. The noble's feast, venison pasty, spiced wine, sweetened fritters dripping with honey. Rich, decadent, but heavy, maybe dangerous. The monk's crust, barley bread, lentils, perhaps a boiled egg. Plain, repetitive, even boring, but balanced. Which would you choose if survival were on the line? Here's your quirky tidbit: skeletons from monastic graveyards show fewer signs of malnutrition than those of peasants. Their bones suggest steady protein and less dental decay. And yet, many also reveal arthritis in knees and backs, evidence that their bodies endured decades of hard labor. Longevity came with a price, joints worn out from fields and desks alike. You breathe in the morning air, crisp and clean, and realize that health here wasn't measured by abs or muscle tone, but by resilience. Could you wake, pray, work, copy, and fast, day after day, year after year? The monks could. Their breakfasts didn't dazzle, but they endured. And maybe endurance was the real goal. Not bursts of pleasure, not morning sugar highs, but the steady hum of a body that could keep rhythm with bells for decades. Still, you wonder, was breakfast only about physical strength, or did the emptiness in their stomachs also serve a higher, less tangible purpose? The bell tolls again, as if in answer, leading you toward the question of how food, or the lack of it, shaped the monk's spiritual metabolism. The bell's hum fades into silence, and you feel your own stomach echo the emptiness. Yet here, in the monastery, that hollow feeling is not a problem to fix but a tool to wield. You begin to notice how hunger itself shapes the rhythm of the day, sharpening focus, bending the body toward prayer. Breakfast wasn't only about survival, it was about spirit. You sit again in the chapel, beams of sunlight filtering through narrow windows. Your belly is light, almost floating, and your thoughts take on a curious clarity. The monks around you kneel, their lips moving silently, their hands folded. You sense how fasting, or eating lightly, draws them inward. Mainstream historians suggest that monastic communities deliberately used meager meals to remind brothers of humility, to weaken the body just enough to anchor the soul. Food was not fuel alone, it was a lever for spiritual discipline. And yet, historians still argue whether hunger truly sharpened prayer or whether it simply exhausted monks into submission. Was the clarity you feel now divine inspiration, or just low blood sugar tricking your brain into quietude? The debate lingers, but here, in this moment, the stillness feels real. You glance at the crucifix, flickering in candlelight, and think of how every crumb of bread, every spoon of lentils, was framed as a spiritual act. Eating wasn't just about health, it was about obedience. A belly half full meant a mind turned fully toward God. Even your grumbling stomach became part of the choir, singing its own hymn of discipline. Here's your quirky tidbit: some abbots believed eating too much dulled prayer, while others believed eating too little distracted it. To solve this paradox, monasteries sometimes experimented with timing. Breakfast might be delayed until mid-morning so hunger became a companion, not a torment. Imagine the delicate balance: enough food to keep a monk from fainting, not enough to make him drowsy. You feel the weight of that balance now. The bread still sits in your belly, heavy but plain, the porridge faintly clinging, the fish salter memory than satisfaction. Yet the lightness in your head pushes you deeper into stillness. You start to sense why monks called hunger a teacher. Every pang is a reminder of dependence, every swallow a lesson in restraint. The chant begins again, low and steady, voices weaving in and out like waves on stone. Your body sways, not with weakness but with rhythm, as if hunger itself has become part of the prayer. You almost laugh at the thought, back home, you'd never think of skipping breakfast to get closer to enlightenment. And yet, here, you see how breakfast shaped not only bodies but souls. Still, not all tables were equal. Beyond these cloister walls, nobles rose to banquets while peasants scraped bowls of gruel. Monks hovered somewhere in between, their breakfast more balanced than peasants, less lavish than lords. And as you leave the chapel, stepping into sunlight once again, you begin to wonder, how did the monastic crust compare to the nobles' feast across the courtyard wall? You wander toward the cloister gate, curiosity tugging you to peek beyond the walls. Across the way lies the manor hall of a local noble, stone towers, banners snapping in the breeze, servants bustling like bees in a hive. There, too, the morning meal is being served, and the contrast could not be sharper. Inside, long tables groan under roasted meats, fresh loaves of white bread, golden butter, spiced wine, even pastries dripping with honey. The scent alone is enough to make your stomach groan in betrayal. You picture a noble lad ladling stew into his bowl at dawn, while you and the monks gnaw barley crusts in silence. Mainstream historians confirm that noble households often ate lavishly from the moment they rose, favoring meat pies, sausages, or delicate pastries made with sugar and almonds imported at ruinous cost. And yet, historians still argue whether this wealth of food equaled health. Rich breakfasts meant gout, indigestion, and shortened lives. Monks, by contrast, may have lacked variety, but their diets kept them leaner, steadier, less prone to the diseases of excess. You imagine both tables side by side, nobles stuffed with venison pasties, monks chewing onion soup. Which looks merrier? The nobles. Which looks more sustainable? Perhaps the monks. Here's your quirky tidbit: in some records, nobles actually envied monastic simplicity. Accounts survive of aristocrats retreating to monasteries for a time, hoping plain meals would restore their health. Imagine a lord complaining of gout, then checking into the cloister like it's a medieval detox spa, begging for nothing more than bread and lentils. You bite your lip, torn between temptation and reflection. The noble's feast seems mouth-watering, indulgent, alive with flavor. But you can almost hear your modern nutritionist whispering, "Careful, it's all fat, salt, and sugar." Meanwhile, the monk's plate looks boring but balanced, designed not for feasting but for decades of rhythm. You turn back toward the cloister, the sound of noble laughter echoing faintly behind you. And another thought occurs: if monks ate differently from nobles, how did they compare with the peasants, the farmers who toiled outside the monastery walls? Their mornings surely weren't feasts, but were they hungrier than the monks, or perhaps even poorer in nutrition? You step out into the village lanes beyond the cloister walls, where peasants rise with the same dawn bells as monks, though their prayers are shorter and their tools heavier. Here, breakfast is not a ritual wrapped in silence but a quick necessity before fields swallow the day. The cottages smell of wood smoke and damp straw, the air tinged with the earthy aroma of boiling grains. You peek inside one hut. A family huddles around a low fire, clay pot bubbling with pottage, a thin stew of oats or barley, thickened with whatever scraps were on hand. A ladle dips, filling wooden bowls with something that looks less like food and more like survival. No cheese wheels here, no honey jars. Just porridge so plain it makes monastic lentils seem luxurious. Mainstream historians note that peasants lived mostly on bread, pottage, and ale, their meals stretched by onions, beans, or a handful of herbs. Breakfast was often cold leftovers from the night before. If a farmer was lucky, a bit of lard or dripping might be smeared onto bread. Eggs? Rare. Meat? Rarer still. And yet, compared to the monks, the peasants sometimes had one advantage: larger portions, if harvests had been kind. Quantity over quality. You sip from a peasant's bowl in your imagination. The flavor is watery, smoky, faintly bitter from wild greens tossed in for bulk. It fills your stomach, but barely, like chewing on the idea of food rather than food itself. Historians still argue whether peasants were more malnourished than monks, but bones tell their own story: stunted growth, worn teeth, harder lives. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest peasants flavored their morning porridge with nettles, which sting when raw but soften into edible greens when boiled. Imagine starting your day with a stingy stew, literally. It's survival cooking at its most ingenious. You picture again the three breakfasts: nobles feasting on pastries, monks with barley crusts, peasants with nettle pottage. The noble laughs, the monk prays, the peasant labors. Each meal reflects not only wealth but worldview, luxury, discipline, survival. And you can't help but compare all three to your own morning bowl of cereal, bright with sugar and marketing. Which is healthier? Which is happier? Which is truly enough? You step back toward the cloister, the monastery's bells calling you home. You've compared nobles and peasants, but the sharpest comparison still waits: monks against you. Could you, in your modern life, survive on their breakfasts, barley bread, lentils, salted fish, without sneaking into your fridge by day 3? The thought makes your stomach tighten as you pass under the cloister arch, preparing to imagine the swap. You slip back through the cloister gate, the noble feast and peasant stew fading behind you, and suddenly the comparison turns personal. Forget nobles and peasants, what about you? Could you actually trade your cereal, coffee, and buttered toast for crusts of barley bread, bowls of lentils, the occasional salted fish? How long before your modern cravings would break you? You picture your own breakfast table at home: a steaming mug of coffee, maybe oatmeal sweetened with fruit, or eggs fried golden in butter. Now replace it with a monk's ration: dense barley bread, a clay cup of weak ale or water, maybe a spoonful of onion stew if the season is generous. The contrast is almost comic. Your modern stomach cries foul at the thought, already plotting midnight raids to the pantry. Mainstream historians point out that monastic diets, while plain, were actually well-rounded by medieval standards: grains, legumes, some dairy, occasional fish. Enough to avoid scurvy, enough to build endurance. But for you, raised on sugars, fats, and caffeine jolts, the shift would feel brutal. Historians still argue whether the health benefits of the monastic diet outweighed its psychological toll. After all, discipline is one thing, daily denial is another. Here's your quirky tidbit: visitors to monasteries sometimes complained about the food, writing in letters that the monks seemed content with prison fare. And yet, when guests stayed long enough, they often admitted they felt lighter, cleaner, even calmer after a week of bread and beans. Imagine checking into a medieval monastery and discovering it's the original detox retreat, minus the yoga mats. You laugh to yourself, picturing the swap. Day 1, you'd manage the bread and water. Day 2, you'd eye the lentils with suspicion. By day 3, you'd be hallucinating about croissants, convinced you smelled bacon where none existed. But maybe, just maybe, by day 10, your body would settle into rhythm. Hunger would dull into background hum, simplicity would stop feeling like punishment, and you'd discover the strange steadiness monks carried for decades. You look down at your hands, sticky with phantom honey, and imagine holding an energy bar or protein shake instead. Which really carries you further? Which truly nourishes? Perhaps the monk's secret was less about the food itself and more about the frame of mind, the willingness to let breakfast be enough. The bell rings again, not to call you to food but to decision. After all this wandering through cloister kitchens and noble halls, after lentils and salted fish, after honey drizzles and nettle stews, one final question waits. Were the monks' breakfasts, in the end, actually healthier than yours, or is the truth more complicated, lingering somewhere between hunger and satisfaction? The bell tolls one last time, echoing across the cloister walls, and you know you've come to the end of your long, meandering breakfast. The question has hovered since the first crust of bread: were the monks' mornings healthier than ours? Or was it simply a different kind of health, born from hunger, rhythm, and restraint? You sit once more at the refectory table, the grainy bread before you, the clay cup of water beside it. No butter, no sugar, no choice. Just the same plain staples that have carried you through each section of this journey. Your modern mind wants to measure calories, vitamins, protein. By those numbers, the monks did surprisingly well. Their meals were rich in fiber, modest in protein, low in sugar, and structured by consistency. Whole grains instead of refined, lentils instead of bacon, honey instead of candy bars. By modern diet charts, they win on points. And yet, historians still argue whether this austere balance was truly health or just survival. Were monks stronger because of their discipline, or weaker because they never knew a satisfied belly? The evidence bends both ways. Their bones suggest endurance, their lifespans often longer than peasants, their minds sharp enough to copy entire libraries. But they also bore signs of arthritis, anemia, and the toll of constant fasting. Health, here, was not the absence of struggle, it was the art of living inside it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some abbots, when asked about diet, replied that monks should never eat enough to feel heavy but never so little that they faint at prayer. Breakfast was a balancing act, a tightrope stretched between body and spirit. And the rope was different for every monk, every day, every hunger pang swallowed in silence. You chew another bite of your imaginary crust, heavy and bland, and picture your real-life morning plate. Coffee, eggs, sweet cereal, fruit. Flavor, variety, pleasure. Which is healthier? You can't quite say. Maybe the monks were right that health isn't just in the body but in the rhythm, the way food shapes your day, slows your pace, reminds you of what is enough. You lean back, the silence of the cloister wrapping around you, and feel the question soften. Maybe it isn't about which breakfast is better. Maybe it's about what each one teaches. The monk's crust and water whisper, be steady, be simple, be grateful. Your modern latte and toast remind you, savor, enjoy, don't take abundance for granted. Two different wisdoms, two different worlds, both asking you to notice the food before you, the way it fills, or fails to fill, your soul. And so you rise, stomach quiet, mind thoughtful, knowing the verdict is less an answer and more a question. Were monk breakfasts healthier? Maybe yes, maybe no. But they were certainly different, and in that difference lies the gentle wonder that carried you through this sleepy tale. The bells grow softer now, fading into the distance, until they sound less like commands and more like a lullaby. You sit in the dim cloister hall, the stone cool against your back, the echo of chanting fading into memory. The bread, the lentils, the honey, the fish, they blur together, no longer meals but fragments of a rhythm, a pattern stretching across centuries. Your breath slows as you picture the monks moving quietly through their mornings. Sandals on stone, robes brushing past, bowls and cups clinking softly in the refectory. Their breakfasts were never about indulgence, never about feasts, they were about enough. Just enough to stand in the fields, to hold a quill steady, to whisper prayers through the hours of the day. Let your mind drift over that word, enough. Not full, not empty. Not starving, not feasting. Just steady, balanced, calm. Like the steady toll of the bell, like the steady rhythm of breath. Imagine the quiet of the cloister garden at dawn. Bees humming softly over blossoms. Dew shining on cabbage leaves. A monk bending low to pull a leek from the soil. The world waking slowly, gently, without rush. No alarms, no deadlines, no bright screens, just the simplicity of morning as it unfolds. Feel your own body soften into that rhythm. Let your breath lengthen, smooth and slow. Let the faint gnaw of hunger fade into calm, as though you, too, have learned to live on less. The monks found peace not in plenty but in stillness, and you can feel a trace of that peace now, wrapping around you like a woolen cloak in the cool dawn air. Sleep comes easily here. The bells grow faint. The garden quiets. The cloister fades into shadow. And you, too, can let go.